All right, welcome everyone to Cyber Talk with Nikolai. We have another exciting episode today, and we're going to talk about compliance. So today we have Karina Klever from Clever Compliance. She is CEO and founder of the company. Spent a lot of time in this particular space. So I'm pretty sure conversation will be exciting. She has a wealth of information to offer, and I have tons of questions to ask. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Karina to have her present herself, what interesting things she can talk about herself, and then we'll dive into all our questions and then we'll continue conversation. Karina?
Sound, Sounds great. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm Karina Klever. I started IT in April 1989. I've been in IT over 35 years now. Did Started as a computer operator, became a computer programmer, got into project managing because I got really bad specs all the time, which is hard if you're a developer. And then in '02, I had a former boss call me and say, come on over to the audit world. And I asked him if he had smoked something funny that day because I didn't know anything about that. But now it's the best thing that's ever happened to me. I've been in GRC for 20 years, working in all kinds of different industries, you know, banking, retail, biotech, of course, small companies, mid-sized companies, very tool agnostic. It doesn't matter what platform you have inside your company. We kind of work with all of them, and we have a bit of a different approach towards GRC, and we stand up governance, risk, and compliance centers of excellence.
That sounds great, Karina. Thank you for that. So let's just start from basically overview, because if we look at our today's space in compliance, there have been tons of different things that came, and organizations have to contend with a lot of different compliance frameworks and regulators and requirements, and they have to watch for different things. Just could you please give us a state of affairs where we are today? What do we need to deal with, and what companies need to watch out for, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so I think I'm seeing a few patterns right in the industry. The first one being we're treating frameworks and regulations at the same level, and they really are not, right? Frameworks are there to only be as guidance for us, and regulations is something we really do have to comply to. And even regulations are broadly written many times. Sometimes they're industry specific, but we need to appropriate all of the controls that come from those influences, right? So, influences being your regulations and frameworks that your company has to abide by needs to really be a brick wall between them and your company, and a process of appropriating those controls. Right now, I'm unfortunately seeing compliance being a checkbox exercise, and we're leaving very large vulnerabilities, kind of gaping holes on the other side, because we're so busy focusing on these check boxes that we're kind of missing some of the common sense controls that we need to have in our environments. So this is kind of what I'm seeing over and over again in the calls that we get, being breached and having a ransomware request. It's because the data downstream most of the time was infiltrated, which really points to weak vendor management controls. And again, this is the checkbox, right? So you get a SOC 2 as part of your vendor assessment, but a lot of people don't stop to read that SOC 2. And most of the SOC 2s I've ever read exclude subservice organizations, which means that if you have a vendor and that vendor is storing, processing, or transporting any of your data, they are probably not directly being accountable for your data. They're probably sending it downstream, and then maybe that vendor is sending it downstream, and then maybe that vendor is sending it downstream. So some of what I'm seeing is a kind of, third, fourth, fifth downstream vendor that obviously has significantly less controls of your data, logical controls, physical access controls, recovery. Maybe their backup is just about as good as yesterday's data, but because the controls aren't there, it's a lot easier to get through, a lot easier to get to, rather. So basically, I think we need to kind of heighten some of these common sense controls a little bit more than we have been, and kind of pull ourselves back from continuing to treat compliance like it's just a checkbox exercise.
I got it. Thank you, Karin, for that. So all those, yes, it's a difficult question and difficult to answer when I can certainly relate to what you just described. So most organizations, when they look at compliance, it just necessary evil that they have to go through, and you're not gonna see a lot of smiles on people when somebody hand them over a questionnaire with 300 questions. Like, okay, now go ahead and answer all those questions, give it back to us tomorrow, and then we're gonna review it. And next week, another organization comes in and does exactly the same thing with exactly the same question, but for whatever reason, they don't want to trust each other's answers. Or whatever answer you gave to ones, for whatever reason, they don't believe they're truthful and they need to have their own answer. So that kind of creates a lot of tension. And I see that the reason organizations don't really want to go in that direction. And it's like, okay, why do I need to answer 50 times the same question? It's still going to be the same answer. Like, why can't you guys figure it out? And how do you see this? Like, because we have, if you look like big frameworks, you have NIST CSF, you have 853, 2700, I mean 27,000 series that most organizations follow, and they pick one of those frameworks and say, yes, I'm going to build my security program based on ISO 27001. So they deliver it, they build it, they implement all controls, and then next thing you know, somebody comes in with SOC compliance. It's like, well, I don't like your answer for 27,000 now give me this answer for this one. So that creates a lot of friction that organizations don't like, because at the end, they still being asked the same questions in different form, but the answer is still going to be the same. So how do you see this, like converging or melding, or do you see this as something that maybe there could be a collective effort that organizations can come together and say, well, why can't you just create something that everyone will consume, is going to be palatable and be addressed most of whatever everyone is asking, and make it stickable, sort of speak, that everyone who else, any regulators who comes after, they can accept what we already done, rather than.
So there's a few approaches for this. The first thing is controls are not being appropriated correctly. So when I talk about appropriation, we do this thing called N to the fourth at Clever Compliance. So we take that big bucket of influence controls, and sometimes those spreadsheets are 10, 12, 14,000 rows, right? And we actually put those rows into a bucket, one of four buckets: now, next, near, never. And this is where N to the fourth comes from. What are we doing right now? And the things that we're doing right now, we have to actually document them. When we document them correctly and we don't use ethereal, nebulous words, so words like occasionally, periodically, sometimes, frequently, they are not succinct words that will actually define controls as
Those
far
are
as
my favorite.
well, but they're not showing when the execution happens. So for me, frequently might be weekly. For you, it might be quarterly. And so when we do that, what we're doing is we're leaving it open for interpretation from the auditor. So the auditor thinks maybe that frequently is daily. So because you don't have those well-defined controls, now you end up actually leaving yourself open basically for interpretation of what that auditor thinks you ought to be doing. So if you write your documents in a way that actually defines which functional group does that control and how frequently that control happens, now you've set yourself up to gather evidence passively and recurringly. So if you have a let's take change management just as an example. One company could say, as part of my change management process, I do CAB once a week. I need 3 approvals from the CAB members to proceed into production. I require a rollback plan, and you have to do a post implementation review before you close the change. Okay, great. A different company will say, we've got 7 members and you have to have majority votes. 4 of them have to, do it provide their approval before it goes out into production. We require QA signature before we even consider this as part of a CAB. We have a communications update template that has to be filled out as part of training staff. And I don't know, there's some other thing. We do a cab once a month because we don't have a high volume instead of weekly. So when you have very specifically written controls, now what you can do is you can create a ticket in whatever native ticketing system you have to execute in that specific timeline to gather the evidence that satisfies the controls in your own policies. And I use the word policies sort of loosely, right? It could be SOPs, it could be processes, it could be procedures, it could be standards, it could be templates, it could be whatever you want to call them, as long as they're published out and they provide your staff guidance on how to successfully perform their job functions and what the actual representation of your company operations are. So if you start from the beginning and say, okay, I'm looking at this big list of 12,000 influences, I'm going to say, here's what I do now. And you focus on that first. You're not boiling the ocean and you're actually producing viable, measurable controls that you can start gathering passive evidence for. And eventually, when you mature, you're going to be able to automate these controls. The next bucket is next. So that's your second N, letter N. That is the thing you're creating a set of project plans for. So as you're going, and again, right, different companies. We use Scrum, great. We're Waterfall, super. I really don't care. We only use Kanban boards. Okay, whatever you're doing to actually track the fact that you want to take these influence controls and you want to operationalize them and you want to make them real, because there's going to be some of those controls where you're going to say, gosh, we're not mature enough yet. We don't do this now, but we want to do this next. So that's your 6 month, if you're small, the maybe 2 year target if you're enterprise size. The third N is near, which is your strategy. So your strategic roadmap is going to include buckets of controls from that still same originating list that you need to do the now, you need to do the next, you need to get to the near, and that's your 3 to 5 year goal. There are also going to be ones that fall into the last N, which is never. And so, there are regulations like, we had FDA governed company that makes drugs, but there are controls in 21 CFR that say if you make goat milk ice cream, you have to use goat milk. And so those are not applicable. You can actually say, I know this comes from a regulation and I have to abide by this regulation, but this particular line item has nothing to do with me. And let me explain why, because I just don't make goat milk ice cream. I'm going to acknowledge it. I'm going to explain why it doesn't apply to me, and I'm going to put it over here in this bucket that I can happily show the auditor. The other problem with these influence documents, which again, combination, regulation, and framework, is they address every single possible technology stack. Frameworks are not written to address your particular technology, your particular maturity, your particular industry, your particular number of locations, or who's on your board and what your organizational stack looks like. So these frameworks have to be treated really as guidance and appropriated to you, because when the auditor shows up, the auditor knows what NIST says. The auditor knows what Sarbanes-Oxley says. They don't need a regurgitation of those things. They know what GLBA says, FFIEC, any of them, ISOs, right? They know what all of those influence documents say. So to take verbatim, nebulously written statements that are supposed to be broadly applicable across a very wide range and verbatim put them into your published documentation is you're kind of leaving yourself open for interpretation from the auditor, and they're going to come in with what they know. So unless you've clearly defined this as part of your operations, you're leaving yourself open for it.
Thank you, Karina, for that. Yeah, it's definitely helpful, and to have organizations are organized around what they need to do and put those things in a bucket. And I think wonderful approach. So one thing that while you were describing all those things that came to mind, and you mentioned my favorite word, auditors. So from your experience, how do you make auditors friends? Because most of the time when auditors come in, organizations start running around looking for things, and it's not really healthy situation or friendly approach to going through audits or going through the stations procedures and so on. So, but I'm pretty sure there are some techniques and some things because auditors are people too, so they have a job to do and they're not trying to make somebody's life hard. But in case there is like big common misunderstanding that auditors are always coming to look for something and they always find and they always have to write you up for something, so that creates a little bit of animosity between organization and the auditors, where people not really forthcoming and providing evidence, are they trying to hold back certain things or do, let's say, weird stuff because they don't feel this friendly atmosphere with sitting as editor when they get in asked questions. So how do you break this barrier when auditors coming in and to create the environment where auditors feel they come into friendly environment, nobody is going to grab pitchforks and torches and shoot them out of there because they just showed up on the door, and the organizations feels also that auditor there to help them to solve problem potentially that they haven't seen yet, they didn't think about it. So how, in your experience, have you seen this, or how would you recommend organizations go about it and make this friendly exchange?
So I think the first thing I'm going to say is you have to make their job as easy as possible, right? So, and I think that comes back to that passive evidence collection. So if your controls are well written, they execute at a certain time frame, you can begin today actually gathering that passive evidence that supports that particular published document, whether it's a policy or a process or an SOP or whatever you have. Get in the habit of doing those small incremental steps operationally on a long term. Because if an auditor shows up, and I'm not talking about some blank, folder that has thousands of documents in it, who wants to wade through that? But if you have a repository that actually says, based on my competency areas, here are my controls that I've executed over the last year, half year, 3 months, 5 years, whatever it is, and you show that recurrence, that is very, very important. Now, if those controls are not well written, you don't know if they failed. Your failure of a control actually feeds your risk register. If you are able to show that you not only have a handle on your own controls, but you're actually acknowledging the ones that have failed, and now you're putting them into that risk registry mitigation process, eventually leading to continual improvement. Now you can basically say, hey, dear auditor, there's all of these basic controls over here that are part of my operations. Let's take a look at our risk register and let me show you what it is we're doing to mitigate some of these failures that we've internally found. There's two types of risks, right? There's the ethereal risk. I may have a brick fall on my head. There might be an earthquake in Los Angeles. A tornado might come through the Midwest and take the roof off your building. Reputational risk, credit risk, right? All of these risks that are out there that we do track. That's one hand, that's one part of the equation. The real part of the equation that ought to be important, more important to us, is our own risks. How do we know, based on our actual operations, what we ought to be worried about? Because we can come up with metrics and KPIs and whiz bang charts and all of these things, but the reality is, if something is broken and we're not using some of our just common sense, we won't know to fix it. And so having a risk registry that reflects those ethereal risks plus your real operational risk is really what's going to get you to that continual improvement cycle and really increase your company's maturity. So when auditors come in, if you are able to give them on a silver platter proof and evidence of controls that have already been happening, and you can prove to them these are the controls that have been failing and here's what we're doing to fix them. You're minimizing also the time for the technicians, and not all technicians should be in front of auditors. I'm going to say it again, not all technicians should be in front of auditors. If you're able to basically give the auditors the information they need, then you've minimized the time that they have with the auditors. Now, there are some people in very high level positions of decisions, board members, executives who really want to play ostrich and they want to stick their head in the sand. And their rationale is, well, I make all this money and it's just easier for me to pay a penalty because it's going to slow my staff down. If you're in a company that is regulated, I really don't recommend that because it's just something that actually GRC is a really, really great thing and helps you operationalize better if you use it the right way. And I'm not talking about the bureaucratic 14,000 row spreadsheet that you have to hire a team for and spend 200,000 hours annually on. I'm talking about starting with your basic core controls that already exist, documenting them, and beginning to see where the gaps are just by measuring your own actual operations.
Thank you for joining us on part 1 with Karina Klever and Clever Compliance, making sense out of compliance. Stay tuned for part 2.
Thanks for joining us. For more information about these topics or IS Squared, please go to www.issquaredinc.com.